Of course, the most amusing criticism of this language law is that coming from Russia. The second largest minority in Russia, after the Tatars in their own separate autonomous region, are Ukrainians. They're always ignored, sadly, by the Ukrainian government, even more so by international organizations like the OSCE, Council of Europe, and elsewhere. They're always also ignored by Western scholars writing on Russia. Because Russia is a federal system, you only then receive benefits as a national minority if you have your own autonomous region, republic, or okrug, or territory. But if you don't have that, if you're scattered around like Ukrainians are, then you don't receive any benefits in terms of education, culture, and state financing. So Ukrainians are disadvantaged. They have their national churches in Russia are closed down, repressed, and they don't have any educational or cultural facilities at all in Russia, even though they are the second largest minority in Russia. If Ukraine applied the same policies that Russia applies to Ukrainians in Russia, if Ukraine applied the same policies in Ukraine to Russians, then Russians living outside the Crimea should have no rights, because the only people who have rights as a national minority are those within a recognized autonomous region, which up until 2014 was the Crimea. So not in Donbass, not in, say, Zaporizhia, nowhere else. If Ukraine had applied the same ruling. But Ukraine was more tolerant. Just go to Ukraine. Even today, you can find Russian publications. Every website of the president, the government, and the parliament is in three languages: English, Ukrainian, and Russian. Again, I think it's rather amusing when Russia applies this. And what's happened, and again, what's not been picked up by Western observers of this, is that the Russian policies applied to Ukrainians in Russia of repression and assimilation of Ukrainians is applied in the same way to territories controlled by Russia inside Ukraine: Crimea, the so-called Donetsk People's Republic, and Lugansk People's Republic, where Ukrainian churches are banned. The only church allowed is the Russian Orthodox Church, where Ukrainian language and culture is disallowed, and where there's a return to kind of harsh policies of Russification. So they've just basically imported those policies from Russia. So I really think that this new language law, criticism of it, is a complete storm in a teacup compared to many countries in the West, including Canada. This is quite a liberal policy. It's also a policy which could be argued using Western terminology that it's one based on supporting affirmative action for a language that previously was looked down upon and repressed. And therefore, the idea that somehow this will be a problem for Ukraine, its integration in Europe, is simply not, as the Hungarians have claimed and the Poles have, is simply not likely to happen. Ukraine, I think, in this respect stands out very well, and Ukraine had a very peaceful resolution of its domestic, internal linguistic, nationality, and separatist problems, for example, in the Crimea, right the way through till the Euromaidan, and it only became violent then because of outside interference, where protests became an armed insurrection because of outside interference. If there wasn't that outside interference, those protests would have been just simply protests. They would have eventually quietened down, and the usual police operations would have taken care of them. So in this respect, Ukraine has not done anything out of the ordinary, and therefore Ukrainian government should actually go on the offensive on these questions and point the finger particularly at places like Russia and say, when are you going to adopt such a liberal language law as we have done in Ukraine?